Hey folks, tonight we're diving into the glory of the Mongol Empire, built by Genghis Khan, the guy who rose from being an orphaned kid, kidnapped and trust issues galore, to the ruler of the largest land empire in human history. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. It's always cool to see who's tuning in from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's start tonight's journey. You just woke up somewhere near the Onan River. You're wrapped in wool that smells like a damp yak. The sun hasn't risen, and neither has your sense of direction. Frost clings to your boots, a thin layer of ice inside your nose, and something snorting way too close to your head. That's your horse, of course. He's your bedmate, your ride, your heater, and sometimes your lunch. Personal space, never heard of it. He breathes on you and steps on your coat as you try to stand up. No apologies coming. Mongol horses don't do sorry. Your camp's stirring. No chit-chat. Everyone just mounts up and bolts like smoke. A kid with a bow as tall as he is gallops past you, yawning mid-run. He looks about 10. His saddle's older than him. He's been riding longer than you've been conscious. You tighten your belt, pack your stuff, and climb on. No foot-stomping ceremonies. No deep breaths of gratitude. No breakfast. You chew jerky while riding. If your jaw hurts, don't worry, you'll be fine by tomorrow, assuming there is a tomorrow. The wind cuts across you. It's not for decoration. It's here to skin the unprepared. You're charging headlong at it. Your face goes numb by the third ridge. Nobody cares. Nobody asks if you're okay. It's either you ride or you become part of the scenery. By noon, you've swapped horses twice, not because you're tired, but because your horse is. You're expected to be tougher than your beast. If your horse is freaking out, you carry more. That's balance. You pee from horseback. You eat from horseback. You fight from horseback. Fall off, and you get trampled. Stop moving, and you get left behind, complain, and no one listens. They figure the wolves got you early. You ride because everyone rides, because there are no roads, no destinations, just speed and survival, and because in the Mongol Empire, walking's for prisoners, and you're not a prisoner yet. You survived the ride. You're still alive. Good job. But now you're hungry, which sucks because breakfast here isn't a meal. It's a challenge. Someone hands you a leather pouch. It sloshes around. That's your morning drink, fermented horse milk. It's white, sour, fizzy, and smells like a saddle after 3 weeks of riding through a war zone. Still, you drink it not because you want to, but because it's all you got. They call it Aerag. Technically, it's alcoholic, but not the friendly kind. It's a reminder that bacteria are real and living in your throat. Mongol kids drink this stuff. Warriors too. Grandma, definitely. If it burns going down, that's how you know it's working. Food. Maybe a piece of dried mutton. Maybe it's gray, shriveled, and hard enough to patch your boots with. You chew for 20 minutes, and it doesn't get smaller. It could just soggier. There's also kurut, a rock-hard dried milk chunk you could chuck as a projectile weapon. Tastes like sour dust, feels like gravel, and makes your teeth question their life choices. You want to cry, but your tears freeze before they fall. You sit on the ground because there's no table, no chair, no napkin, just wind, wool, and the distinct smell of someone boiling something with hooves. Breakfast here isn't a meal, it's a challenge. Someone hands you a leather pouch. It spills everywhere. That's your morning drink. Fermented horse milk. It's white, sour, kind of fizzy, and smells like a saddle after 3 weeks riding through a war zone. You drink it anyway, not because you want to, but because that's what's available. It's called Irag, technically alcoholic, but not the kind you sip at brunch. This stuff reminds you bacteria are real and they live in your throat. Now, Mongol kids drink this. So do warriors. And grandma too, if it burns going down. That's how you know it's working. Food, maybe a piece of dried mutton, gray, wrinkly, and so tough you could use it to fix your boots. You chew it for 20 minutes, and it doesn't shrink, just gets wetter. Also, some kurut, rock-hard dried milk, lumps you could throw like a weapon. Tastes like sour dust, feels like gravel, and makes your teeth question their life choices. You're about to cry, but your tears freeze before they fall. You sit on the ground because there's no table, no chair, no napkins, just wind, wool, and the distinct smell of someone boiling something with hooves. No forks, no spoons, just your hands and the silent judgment of the old man across from you who's already finished his meal, tied a new saddle strap, and is now sharpening his knife with a focus usually reserved for religious experiences. You eat what you're given, you don't ask what it is. That's the best way to avoid being fed again. No chit-chat. Mongols don't waste time on small talk before battle, after, or during meals. They eat like they ride horses fast, quiet, and ready to move at any second. You try to keep up, but you fail. The sheep resists. You're still hungry, not satisfied, but hey, at least you're a little less starving, and in the end, that's something. The Mongol Empire. That counts as a win. It's now mid-morning. The horses are sweating. So are you, and you might be wondering, when exactly do you wash your face? You don't. In the Mongol Empire, being clean isn't about soap or showers. It's about not dying from infection. And even that's negotiable. You smell like leather, horses, smoked meat, and a faint, sour hint of whatever made your boots. Everyone smells the same. Nobody comments. If you show up smelling like flowers, you're either a spy or cursed. Maybe both. Water's for drinking, not bathing. Want to wash with river water? That's your drinking water. Want to die quietly from descent? Go ahead. Otherwise, just wipe your face with your sleeve and keep moving. No soap. Animal fat. Yes. Ash. Yes. Sand. Definitely. Want to exfoliate? Rub a handful of dust on your face and pretend you're at a spa. Your hands are filthy. Your fingernails are weapons. Your hair hasn't seen water in months, but is still tied up neatly under your hat because looks still matter, just not the clean kind. More like the greasy kind. That's respected. You don't get rid of lice. You manage them. You name them. You throw them in the fire during evening chats. If they bite too much, you smear animal fat on yourself and dare them to bite again. Your clothes are all wool. They're stiff. This jacket's been worn for 3 winters and still stained with goat blood from a fight you vaguely remember having. You can't change it. You layer it. Add more layers in winter. Peel them off in summer. Underwear probably doesn't exist. Shame also probably doesn't exist. Your teeth, though, that's your own problem. No brushing, no rinsing. You chew bones. You drink plain water. You hope the breakfast acid slowly dissolves whatever's stuck between your teeth. You always carry a knife, not for enemies, but for when that tooth decides it's done living in your head. So no baths for you. You're riding through wind. You're sweating horse sweat. You get a bouquet overflowing with humanity's crudeness. But look on the bright side, no one can smell your stench on themselves. Now that you've forgotten everything you knew about hygiene, it's time to step into your first battle. You ride all morning until afternoon. No one tells you where you're going. You just go, and then you see them. A cluster of moving dots on the horizon. Riders like you, but not exactly like you, because they're not here to share fermented milk and stories. They're here to die or kill you. It's flexible. Don't panic. No one panics. Everyone just grabs their bows. Mongol bows are short, curved, dangerous, and heavier than they look, made from layers of horn, wood, and raw determination. They don't forgive mistakes. They never miss twice. You notch your arrow. Your horse keeps moving. You don't slow down. That's embarrassing. You twist, lean into the wind, and relax. It flies. So do theirs. Welcome to Mongol warfare. No glorious sword fights. No chivalrous bling. Just arrows. Smart, unromantic arrows, shot continuously from insane distances while galloping. Blink and 3 of your enemies are lying on the ground. 2 more head the other way, probably reconsidering their life choices. The trick here is movement, always moving. Enemies try to close in. You retreat, but not out of fear. It's a fake retreat, the famous kind. Let them think you're running. Let them chase, then turn back and shoot them in the face. You're part of the dance. Fast, precise, brutal. No screams, no battle cries, just twangs of bowstrings breaking and dull thuds. You hear a yell. It's short. You don't look back. Your arrows aren't just the famous fake retreat. Let them think you're running away. Let them chase, then turn around and shoot them right in the face. You're part of a dance. Quick, precise, brutal. No screaming, no battle cries. Just the snap of bowstrings and dull thuds. You hear a shout. It's brief. You don't look back. Your arrows aren't just sharp. They're poisoned. This isn't personal. It's practical. Wound 1 enemy and slow down his whole squad. Injure 2, and you've stopped their entire flank. Efficiency beats honor here. You've probably fired about 50 arrows. Forgot already. Fine, there's another quiver of 70 on your saddle. Keep shooting until your fingers blister, then shoot some more. Because if you stop, you lose your fingers altogether. As dusk falls, the battle's over. You have no clue how many people you killed. No one does. Nobody's counting. Only thing that matters, you're still riding. No celebrations. You wipe your blade, you eat, you sleep, and tomorrow you ride again. The battle's done. The sun sets behind the hills. No singing, no parades, just the crackle of fire and the quiet sound of something being chopped nearby. Dinner. You eat what you kill. If you didn't kill anything today, don't sweat it. Someone else did. You just help prep. That means skinning, slicing, pan frying, or occasionally stabbing that goat again because it's still twitching. Tough meat, of course. It came from an animal that spent its whole life climbing hills in blizzards. You roast it on an iron skewer that's been in your family longer than most of your relatives. No spices, no salt, no rituals. If there's less blood than on your fingers, it's ready. You sit in a circle, chewing silently. Everyone stares at the fire like it owes them money. A warrior next to you, not some clean rib bone, licks it, then tosses it behind him like it might grow into another goat. Fat is the best part, rich, nutritious, and absolutely vital for staying alive. The Mongols valued fat more than anything, not for flavor, but because it clings to the ribs and keeps your soul from freezing. Solid at night. You don't question it. You bite into it like it personally offended your ancestors. No bread, no greens, just meat, milk, and something in a wooden bowl that might be soup or regret food. If someone hands you an organ, you take it, you eat it, you don't ask how that life was. Curiosity is a luxury. You're not nobility. You're not a guest. You're a stomach on legs with a knife. No cleanup after eating. Bones for the dogs. Ashes for the wind. You wipe your hands on your cloak, which doubles as napkin, towel, and winter blanket. Hygiene is still just a theory. Someone burps. That's considered polite. You do it too. Congrats. You're adapting, then lying on a wool-wrapped bed next to a snoring horse. You dream of meat because that's what tomorrow will bring, and if not, you'll have to ride farther until it does. No announcements, no first snowflakes drifting gently from the sky. One night, you go to bed without shoes. Next thing you know, your boots are frozen solid, and so is your will to live. Welcome winter on the doorstep. The cold doesn't just get colder, it becomes brutal. A bone-chilling, soul-crushing cold wraps your ribs and whispers, "You're never allowed here." The wind doesn't howl, it bites. Sharp teeth aimed at your ears. Your breath turns to mist, then freezing, then regret. Now you sleep with your horse, not near it, with it. You lean your back against it, like it's a lover made of hay and muscle. Awkwards, sure, but at least it's warm. Clothes become a game of layers. Wool over skin over fur. By mid-morning, you've lost feeling in your fingers. By the next day, your toes go numb too. You try not to think about it. If they come back, great. If not, less to lose. No firewood, no forest, just frozen poop. You burn it without asking questions. It smells like betrayal, but with enthusiasm. Smoke swirls in your face. making your eyes water. You blink, and your eyelashes freeze. Now you're part of a sculpture. Your frozen tears, cold stone for your food, your nose is bleeding. Still, you keep going. Mongols don't stop for weather. If it's not arrows or plague, it's not worth mentioning. You ride with snow in your shoes and wind in your bones, and nobody cares, like betrayal. But with a warm hug, smoke swirls around your face, making your eyes water. You blink and your lashes freeze solid. Now you're part of the sculpture. Your ice water, cold rocks for your food, your nose is bleeding. But you keep going. Mongols don't stop to check the weather. If it's not arrows or plague, it's not worth mentioning. You ride with snow in your boots and wind in your bones, and nobody cares, especially the horses, who seem to love it. The cold changes you. It steals your voice, dries your skin, and rewrites your personality into something quieter, tougher, and less optimistic. You stop complaining, not because you're stubborn, but because your jaw won't move. Still, you keep moving, because if you stop, you freeze. And if you freeze, someone buries you under a pile of ice and runs off. No breaks here. The Empire doesn't wait for spring. Neither do you. He doesn't look like some legend. He's sitting cross-legged on a plain wooden platform, chewing dried meat with all the enthusiasm of a bored butcher. His fur lining is weather-beaten, his beard's patchy, his shoes are bloody, though it's unclear if that's from battle, a goat, or last week's argument with the tax collector. This is your Khan, your general, your leader, the guy who can wipe a city off the map with just a raised eyebrow. You don't speak unless ordered. Don't stare too long either. Definitely don't correct his pronunciation, even if he calls you the blonde girl for 6 months straight. He speaks softly. Mongol leaders don't yell. If you can't hear him, well, that's your problem. Listen harder, read his tone, or tune into your own heartbeat, because right now, it's louder than his voice. Orders are short, sharp, and absolute. Go here, burn that. Accept tribute. Behead the messenger. Don't come back until it's done. You nod. Everyone nods. Even the grumpiest warriors. The ones who just escaped a fire nod like nervous kids at school. A man coughs at the briefing. Now he's gone. No one mentions him anymore. Your Khan doesn't care about feelings. He cares about results. Did the city fall? Did you bring back tribute? Is the caravan moving? Are the horses fed? If the answer to any of these is no, you'd better have an arm missing as your excuse. His tent isn't fancy but stuffed with maps. Tons of maps, all hand-drawn, all annotated on a scroll that looks like a hawk trying calligraphy. You don't get it. He gets it all. He sees rivers as roads, mountains as minor annoyances, and kingdoms as little prizes wrapped in bad diplomacy. You get your orders, you leave, no questions, no hanging around. You saddle up and ride back out into the cold, because in the Mongol Empire, leadership isn't about charm, it's about survival, and those who question the Khan rarely get a second chance. You ride into strange lands carrying a message. Today, you're not a soldier, you're an ambassador. That doesn't mean you're safe. You ride with a small escort, a truce flag, and the confidence of someone who knows that behind you are thousands of warriors, ready to burn an entire civilization to ash if your letter isn't warmly welcomed. The letter itself is simple, direct, just a few short lines written in Mongolian, Persian, maybe Chinese. Depending on the poor soul receiving it, it basically says, surrender to us or don't. Either way, we're coming back. It's sealed with the Khan's mark, a bit of wax that could be doused in gasoline. Considering what happens if you say no, you ride into cities with marble gates, golden domes, silk curtains, and nervous guards. You've been fed, you're interrogated, you're stared at like a hungry wolf invited to dinner. You're polite, you're calm. You slowly explain that submitting is in everyone's best interest. Mongol protection means more trade, order, and fewer massacres. Refusal means fire, arrows, and the complete demolition of anything that looks like a building. Sometimes they say yes, they hand over tribute, horses, gold, and daughters. You nod, leave, and report back. That city still stands today. Sometimes they hesitate. They whisper behind closed doors. They send back vague answers and suspiciously generous gifts. You accept them. You smile. You, with the Khan's mark. A bit of hard wax, soaked in gasoline, considering what happens after you get rejected. You ride into cities with marble gates, golden domes, silk curtains, and nervous guards. You've been fed. You're being interrogated. You're stared at like a hungry wolf invited to dinner. You're so polite. You're calm. You explain slowly that submission is in everyone's best interest. Mongol protection brings benefits, trade, order, and fewer massacres. Refusal means fire, arrows, and total demolition of anything that looks like a building. Sometimes they say yes. They offer tribute horses, gold, and daughters. You nod. You leave. You report back. That city still stands today. Sometimes they hesitate, whispering behind closed doors. They send vague answers and suspiciously generous gifts back to you. You accept them, you smile, you write everything down, and sometimes they kill the messenger. Bad move. You don't get revenge with complaints. You get revenge with siege weapons, mounted archers, psychological warfare, and creative use of severed heads as decorative warning signs. Diplomacy is quick in the Mongol Empire. One message, one chance. No second letters, no passive negotiations, just aggression. You deliver the Khan's will, ignore it. And his reply arrives on the backs of 40,000 horseback archers and some very enthusiastic engineers. No arguing, no negotiating. You just deliver. And if the world listens, it survives. You've stepped into what they call the Mongol capital. You expect walls, a palace with polished floors, maybe some dude selling figs with a fancy hat. Instead, you see a sea of yurts, felt-covered domes, dozens, hundreds of them. They sprout across the steppe like mushrooms after rain. No stone, no marble, just wool, smoke, and the smell of something boiling. This is Karakorum, the capital, the heart of an empire stretching from the Korean peninsula all the way to Europe's doorstep, and It looks like someone lost a sheep wrangling contest. But don't be fooled. It works. Yurts aren't. Shacks. They're mobile command centers. Each one can be torn down in an hour and rebuilt by nightfall. You can burn a city. You can't burn something that's vanished by morning. The Coggins yurt is bigger than the rest. The entrance faces south, always. You don't get in without an invite. Inside felt, furs, scrolls, and a throne that looks more like a sturdy barricade against unruly guests than a seat of power. People come here from all over the empire, merchants from Baghdad, princes from Kiev, spies from the Song dynasty, all sitting cross-legged, sipping mare's milk, pretending not to notice the woman in the corner carving up a deer with a spoon. No European-style bureaucracy, no tower full of scribes, just a man with a steel trap memory and a handful of assistants writing everything down with bone styluses. Their tone slightly terrified. Laws are made. Edicts get sent out on horseback. Paper is precious. Ink's pricey. Mistakes are deadly. But the streets stay clean. The roads are safe. Trade routes pulse like lifeblood. No room for poverty. You're either useful or you're out riding somewhere to become useful. This isn't Rome, not Baghdad. This is the Mongol answer to urban civilization mobile. Brutal, efficient, no towers, no statues, just felt, fire, and the awareness that the whole city can vanish at sunrise and reappear 5 valleys over, like it never existed. You steal a horse, you're hungry, you're freezing, seems no one's watching. You figure a quick trip too, maybe 3 miles. Maybe you'll bring it back. They catch you before. You hit a tree. Now you're kneeling before a man with a mustache sharp enough to be a weapon. He's not angry. No yelling. Just pointing at the horse. At you. Then at a nearby rock. Flat. Wide. Ready for action. You're about to learn something important. No prisons. No appeals. No 16-step legal process. Justice in the Mongol Empire comes in 2 flavors, revenge or removal. If you steal, pay double if you can. If not, something else gets taken. A finger, a hand, sometimes your head, depending on the mood and the market value of what you tried to nick. You give a brief defense, because Mongols love clarity, ramble too long, and they think you're lying. You cut your explanation down to 3 words, hoping they count as a character reference. The elders discuss. One spits, another shrugs, then they nod. Verdict, you live. Period, you walk. Meaning no more driving. The horse is gone. Now you have to walk with the caravan until your honor is cleared, a process that can take 1 or many seasons. No deadlines. Mongols aren't big on rehab. Either you're punished or you're not. Then they expect you to keep up. Killing might mean death unless it's a legit blood feud, in which case you owe livestock, labor, or a wife to the family. Best case. All 3. Lying to your commander death hurts a bit more than that. The Mongols did things differently. Death causing injury to foreigners, strictly off limits. Double death with extra ceremony. On the flip side, honesty, bravery, and generosity were deeply respected, even if You smell like fermented despair and move like a sack of potatoes. If you tell the truth and keep your promises, you're still considered worth looking after. Mongol law was brutal, sure, but fast, predictable, and impossible to bribe. You always knew where you stood, usually in front of someone wielding a sword, and if your conscience was clean, chances are your hands were too. The scout team rides back. Silence, just nodding westward, where smoke rises like a promise. That's a city with walls and defenses. The kind of place people actually believe gates and guards mean something. Adorable. You ride out. At dawn, behind you, engineers push carts stuffed with surprises ropes, axes, portable heaters, collapsible siege gear. The Mongol party favors. Basically, no fancy speeches, no blessings, no booming drums, just a handful of hand signals, and the subtle hum of 5,000 men raising their bows. First, you circle, always circle, watch closely. You note weak points, a leaning tower, a misplaced gate, a patch of wall looking like it's seen a few too many centuries. You whisper observations to the captain, who grumbles and scratches something in the dirt with a dagger. Then the noise starts yelling. Horns, fire. You don't charge straight in, you wait. Let panic do its job. Let the townsfolk wrestle with the big question, hide the gold or bury the kids. Every second they hesitate. Your engineers inch closer with ladders and their very polite catapults. Walls, not a problem. Mongols build siege towers on site with whatever's lying around trees, stones, and sometimes furniture from a recently evacuated monastery. You don't bring gear, you bring confidence. Archers whip up a storm, not just a volley, but a full-on weather system. Arrows blacken the sky and pour down like a gentle rain of progress. Then you ride in, you batter the gate, not like a hammer, but like wind with teeth. You flood through the lock, sword drawn, horse foaming at the mouth, eyes narrowing not from anger, but calculation. This isn't madness, it's math. Every alley you pass brings you one step closer to the granary. Every nook you conquer is logistics. You're not looting out of greed. You loot for supplies. And when the towers fall and banners come down, you don't gloat. You inventory who surrendered, who resisted, who's useful, who's just decoration. The rest vanish quickly and efficiently. And when night falls, the city belongs to the Mongols. Meanwhile, you've planned to move on tomorrow. Banners hung, bodies laid down. The city is quiet now. Silence settles once everyone realizes who's in charge. You, the winner. You, the panting horses. The outsiders elbow deep in the siege machine this morning. Now reviewing tax laws over mutton stew, because that's how it works. In the Mongol Empire, conquest wasn't the final goal. It was the orientation phase. Locals peeked out from broken windows and ruined temples, expecting looting, pillaging, decades of usual resentment. Instead, they got greeted by a guy in a fur coat holding a list of professions. Mongols didn't destroy everything, just what resisted. The rest got cataloged. If you were a blacksmith, you stayed. If you were a weaver, same deal. If you were a scholar, congrats. Now you work for a man who never read a book, but knows exactly how many arrows it takes to erase a library. No formal government, just you and a few scribes, plus a mountain of Mongol common sense. You appoint officials, preferably locals who understand the language and how not to get stabbed while collecting taxes. The rules are simple. Follow KHN, pay your dues, don't cause trouble. If that sounds vague, don't worry. Enforcement is crystal clear. One warning, then the rope. Trade routes will be reopened by noon, toll booths staffed at night, and the market kept selling grilled fish like nothing happened. Nothing crazy yet, because trade was the empire's second religion, right after horse worship. Of course, you don't shove your culture down anyone's throat. No statues to build. Just make sure the grain gets counted and the caravans leave on time. Mongol rule wasn't about identity. It was all about efficiency. Keep your temples and customs. Sure, but rebellion? Nope. Attack orders given. Census takers on the move. And by the weekend, those same folks who shouted yesterday are now grateful the roads are safer. You conquered them, yes. But you also sped up delivery times. Now you're heading west, further west than you've ever been, past familiar grasslands, through cities you helped sack, even past yurts with familiar curses carved on them. This is the frontier, the rough edge of the empire, where the air thins and rumors thicken. No one's handing you directions. Directions here are for folks with roads. What you get instead are gestures, a shrug toward a mountain, a vague wave over a smoky valley, and the eternal Mongol phrase, follow the bones. Here, you pass by things the empire hasn't decided whether to admit or ignore. Weird stone towers, half-built, abandoned forts, trees tied with ribbons, gifts for gods who clearly stopped answering mail. You pass a monastery with torn doors. Inside, incense and silence. A monk bows, offers you tea, and doesn't bat an eye as you drag mud across his holy floor. He's seen people like you before. He knows what happens when someone says no. Then come whispers, rumors about ghost armies, cities that vanish overnight. A mountain pass where the Khan's brother disappeared, returning 2 years later with a grin and eyes that never blink. You don't buy most of it, but slow down anyway. At night, you camp in silence. No fire, no laughter, just you, your horse, and wolves arguing theology nearby. You pull your cloak tighter and check your sword twice, not because of bandits, but because stories start with no one rides through here, not even your horse. It's nervous. It beats the darkness. And this is a horse that ate people and napped through lightning. The empire's edge isn't marked by fences. It's marked by atmosphere, thinning orders, stretched logic. Here, the Khan's word arrives late and often whispered, yet his commands are clear. Scout, observe, return. You do all three in that order. You note every strange village, every unfinished temple, every field where grass grows sideways, and when you come back to civilization, You feel the empire stayed behind you, heavy, brutal, and real. This time, the shoreline doesn't swallow you whole. You return maybe not in glory, but intact, which in Mongol terms is almost holy. Your horse is skinnier, your boots are bloodied, your teeth fewer. But your scroll bag is full names, maps, tribute stats, and sometimes sketches of weird-looking forts. You hand it over to me. The scribe nods. A commander grumbles. The empire keeps on ticking, and one day, far from here, in a quiet European library or a busy Chinese court, someone will unroll a scroll and frown at your name. They won't pronounce it right. They won't get the abbreviations. They'll look at the numbers you counted on, numb fingers after 3 sleepless days, and say, "These numbers are definitely exaggerated," because history has a funny habit. It softens the parts that make you nervous, and the Mongol Empire makes historians very nervous. They'll call you savages, barbarians, a mob, as if you were just a herd of horses and shadowy names without trade routes, diplomats, or laws etched in blood and common sense. Frozen fingers after 3 sleepless days, saying, "These numbers are definitely exaggerated," because history has a funny habit. It smooths over the parts that make you nervous, and the Mongol Empire makes historians very nervous. They'll call you savages, barbarians, a mob like you're just a bunch of horsemen and nobodies with no trade routes, no diplomats, no law system, carved in blood and common sense. They'll forget the engineers, the postal system, and religious tolerance. They'll remember the sieges. Who wouldn't? But not the fact you demanded cities surrender before leveling them. You brought peace, order, and lower tolls. They'll paint your face twisted with rage, never showing the months you spent negotiating water rights with a guy who showers once every 10 years. They'll turn your practical rule into chaos, your brutal discipline into madness, your efficient conquest into random destruction, and they'll conveniently skip the part where their kingdoms had already fallen apart from the inside, long before you showed up with torches and battle plans. But you don't care, because you're not building a legacy. You're building actual roads. You're making empires answer for their walls. You're making the world smaller, one hoofbeat at a time. And if the world only remembers you as a shadow from the east, that's fine. Charlemagne's exact birthplace is as mysterious as a monk's tax records. Some say he was born in Hurst. Others argue Aachen or Ingelheim is more likely. The truth is, in the mid-8th century, nobody cared about birth certificates, especially for future emperors. What we know is this: around 742 a boy was born, the son of Pippin the Short and Bertrada of Laon, and this boy would shape medieval Europe. Pippin wasn't your average Frankish noble. He just pulled off one of the smartest political coups of the time. He deposed Childrich III, the Merovingian puppet king, and got the Pope's blessing to crown himself King of the Franks. That means young Charlemagne wasn't just born into power, but into a dynasty that was redefining what legitimate rule meant. Charlemagne's childhood wasn't about chasing frogs in meadows. He was being prepared, prepped for war, laws, and theology sometimes all at once. Frankish education wasn't exactly poetry. That means young Charlemagne wasn't just born into a powerful family, but into a dynasty that just redefined what legitimate rule even means. Charlemagne's childhood wasn't about chasing frogs in meadows. He was being prepared for war, law, and theology, sometimes all at once. Frankish education wasn't exactly poetry and philosophy. Mostly it was swords, prayers, and how to stop angry nobles from stabbing you in your sleep. His tutor, maybe a guy named Fulrad, wasn't big on bedtime stories, but loved Latin prayers, or feeling my wrath. We don't know much about Charlemagne's young personality. He left no diary, and his biographers, Einhard wrote about him like a superfan, obsessing over their secret crush. But one thing's clear, even as a kid, Charlemagne stood out, not just because he was over 6 feet tall, when 5 feet was already impressive, but also because he led like a duck to water, or more accurately, like a Frank charging into conquest. When his dad died in 768, Charlemagne was ready to inherit the kingdom. Well, half of it anyway. Classic medieval style, the kingdom got split between him and his brother, Carloman, sharing power. Yeah, never smooth, whether you're a monarchy or just trying to split the last slice of pizza at family dinner. So naturally, tensions flared, but for now, Charlemagne was officially king, was young, ambitious, and aiming for a Europe that hadn't been united since Rome was cool, crown on his head, sword in his hand, and Europe was about to meet its new architect. Charlemagne's first challenge wasn't foreign invaders or noble rebellions. Nope, it was Carloman, his brother and fellow crown wearer, Pepin the Short, with all his wisdom, had split the Frankish kingdom, giving Charlemagne the west and Carloman the east. Theoretically, a peaceful partnership. In reality, a passive-aggressive sword fight disaster. The brothers were anything but friendly. Their lands were technically allies, but their courts felt like enemy barracks. Carloman was suspicious, arrogant, and probably just plain difficult. Charlemagne showed signs of being a ruthless strategist, and he wasn't about to let his little brother clip his wings. Tensions rose over petty slights and political manipulation, a standout moment when Charlemagne was called to help crush a rebellion in Aquitaine. Carloman refused to send troops. Classic little brother move. Sit back, let big bro fight, then sulk when he gets praised. Meanwhile, Desiderius, king of the Lombards in northern Italy, stepped into this awkward mess. He offered Charlemagne his daughter's hand in marriage in exchange for peace and cooperation. Charlemagne, the opportunist, said yes and married her. Carloman called it betrayal. Desiderius had backed their dad, and now Charlemagne was buddy-buddy with him. Medieval soap opera alert. And just when things were about to get uglier, Carloman died unexpectedly in 771, only 3 years into their co-rule. Carloman dropped dead at 20. Officially natural causes, which in medieval speak could mean anything from pneumonia to looking at someone the wrong way. Charlemagne wasted no time. He marched into his brother's lands like he'd planned it from day one. The widow and Carloman's kids ran off. Guess who was pissed? Desiderius. So Charlemagne now ruled all of Francia. No brothers, no allies, just one man, one crown, and a growing hit list. Next up on the list, the in-laws. After Carloman was gone, Charlemagne had a kingdom to himself and a problem in Italy. Desiderius, king of the Lombards, the guy whose daughter Charlemagne married and then quietly divorced right after Carloman died. Awkward. Desiderius was not happy. Worse, he took in Carloman's widow and sons and openly backed their claim to Charlemagne's throne. That's not just messy medieval politics. That's a declaration of war with a bow on it. Charlemagne didn't hesitate. In 773, he led his army over the Alps. And no, this wasn't a leisurely summer stroll. Crossing the Alps meant snow, narrow passes, and the occasional surprise avalanche. But Charlemagne didn't care. Mountains, family drama, bad weather, none of it was going to stop him from getting what he wanted when he arrived in Italy. Charlemagne laid siege to Pavia, the Lombard capital. Desiderius dug in deep down the long corridors. Unfortunately for Charlemagne, on top of that, the guy took in Carloman's widow and sons and now openly backed their claim to Charlemagne's throne. That wasn't just awkward for medieval politics. Basically, it was a declaration of war with a bow attached. Charlemagne didn't hesitate. In 773, he led his army across the Alps. And no, this wasn't a casual summer hike through the mountains. Crossing the Alps meant snow, narrow passes, and occasional surprise avalanches. But Charlemagne didn't care. Mountains, family drama, or bad weather weren't going to stop him from getting what he wanted. Once in Italy, Charlemagne laid siege to Pavia, the Lombard capital. Desiderius dug in deep in the long corridors. Too bad for Charlemagne. His patience was about that of a monk copying scripture. He besieged the city and waited. Months dragged on. Supplies ran low. Morale tanked. By 774, Pavia surrendered, and Charlemagne didn't just win a battle, he claimed the Lombard crown for himself. Yep, no puppet ruler, no sweetheart deals with local nobles. He just straight up declared himself king of the Lombards. That move made him ruler of both the Franks and the Lombards, a bold medieval power play that echoed all the way to Rome. Speaking of Rome, Pope Adrian, I watched all this drama from Vatican City like a bishop holding his breath during a chess match. Desiderius had previously threatened the Papal States, so the Pope was really hoping Charlemagne would be his knight in shining armor, and Charlemagne delivered, earning the Pope's blessing and a cozy alliance with the Church that lasted decades. The Lombard campaign wasn't just a family feud turned conquest. It was a statement. Charlemagne wasn't playing by the old tribal rules anymore. He was building an empire, and now, backed by God's representative on earth, saying no to him got a whole lot harder. After taking Italy and getting a warm welcome from the Pope, Charlemagne set his sights north, eyeing the Saxons. These guys weren't sipping wine in fancy castles. They were pagan, wild, battle-hungry tribes who hated Christianity like it was last season's fashion. They'd been raiding Frankish borders for years, looting villages and disrespecting all things holy. Charlemagne had had enough. Starting in 772, he launched what would become his most infamous campaign, the Saxon Wars. Not one war, but 18 separate campaigns over 30 years, because those Saxons, bless their forest-loving hearts, refused to quit. At first, Charlemagne marched into Saxony, burned their sacred monal tree, basically their holy tree, and declared, "Time to convert, folks." The Saxons, proud warriors all, smiled politely and said, "Sure, no problem." Then, as soon as Charlemagne's army left, boom, rebellion, rinse, and repeat. Charlemagne would roll in, crush the resistance, baptize a few thousand terrified locals at sword point, then take off. The Saxons, they'd torture priests, trash churches, and go back to worshipping their old gods. The most infamous moment in 782, after a massive uprising, Charlemagne ordered the massacre at Verdun, about 4,500 Saxons executed in one day. Even by medieval standards, that was brutal, and it sent a crystal clear message. Conversion isn't optional, it's mandatory. By now, Charlemagne wasn't just after obedience, he wanted spiritual submission. He truly believed a Christian's job was to save souls. Even if it took fire and sword, monks followed his army. Churches sprang up as fast as fortresses, and any Saxon who refused baptism, let's just say the baptismal font, came with a backup sword. But despite all his efforts, the Saxons still wouldn't bend. The forests of northern Germany turned into graveyards for Frankish soldiers and a test of Charlemagne's patience. Year after year, rebellion after rebellion. The war dragged on. Charlemagne wasn't just a sword-wielding conqueror. He had a soft spot for books, too. Yep. The guy who spent decades forcing Saxons into baptism also kick-started one of Europe's biggest educational revivals. Welcome to the Carolingian Renaissance. Less about oil paintings, more about making sure monks could actually spell. See, Charlemagne hit a snag. His empire was growing faster than anyone could manage, and the priests, nobles, and officials he trusted, let's just say they were functionally illiterate. The government was turning into a medieval game of telephone, and even the Bible was getting creatively interpreted. He also had a special love for books. Yep. The same guy who spent decades forcing the Saxons into baptism was also the brains behind one of Europe's biggest educational revivals. Welcome to the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement less about oil paintings and more about making sure monks could actually spell. See, Charlemagne had a problem. His empire grew faster than anyone could manage, and the priests, nobles, and officials he trusted were, let's just say, functionally illiterate. The government was basically a medieval game of telephone. Even the Bible was getting some creative interpretations. So Charlemagne did something radical. He declared education super important. He invited the sharpest scholars in Europe to his court. Leading the pack was Alcuin of York, a serious Anglo-Saxon intellectual who probably thought bad Latin was the medieval equivalent of a comic book artist's kid under Alcuin's guidance. Charlemagne set up palace schools, created curriculum standards, and made monasteries double as classrooms. And Charlemagne set up palace schools, made curriculum rules, and insisted monasteries act like classrooms too. And This wasn't just for the fancy folks. Charlemagne wanted everyone from priests and scholars to peasants to get a shot at reading and writing. In Latin? Of course, because what's studying worth if you can't? Read the Vulgate, ironically. Despite his love of learning, Charlemagne himself was basically illiterate. He spoke tons of languages, but struggled with reading and writing. Legend says he kept wax tablets under his pillow, practicing penmanship at night. But ruling an empire doesn't leave much time for handwriting drills. Still, Charlemagne led by example. He cared about knowledge. He respected scholars. He even standardized handwriting. Yep, that neat, easy to read Carolingian script. That modern font's copy that's on him. Before that, manuscripts looked like someone had a seizure with an ink pot. Thanks to him, thousands of ancient texts survived. Monks started copying manuscripts like their lives depended on it because sometimes they did. Literacy rates improved, the church got more unified, and Europe cautiously stepped out of the Dark Ages. Now it's Christmas Day, 800 AD. Rome's streets are freezing, churches are packed, and Charlemagne is at St. Peter's Basilica, playing the good Christian king, or at least that's what everyone thought, until Pope Leo III pulled one of the most dramatic mic drops in medieval history while Charlemagne was kneeling in prayer. The Pope suddenly plopped a golden crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. Just like that. No heads up, no fancy ceremony. No hey Charles, wanna be Emperor Nope. Boom, empire formed. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne knew this was coming. Some say it was staged. Others think he was blindsided. Charlemagne himself later claimed he'd never have entered the church if he'd known. Classic emperor excuse. Either way, the symbolism was huge. The Roman Empire had fallen in 476. Over 3 centuries later, the Pope revived it with Charlemagne as its new head, a Frankish king crowned by the church, ruling a mix of Germanic tribes, Lombards, and Latin-speaking clergy. The Holy Roman Empire was born, though the name wasn't used right away. This moment changed everything. Charlemagne's power wasn't just military anymore. It was spiritual and sacred. Now he was seen as Caesar's heir, a Christian Caesar with the Pope as both ally and spiritual referee. Not everyone was thrilled, though. The Byzantines in Constantinople had called themselves Roman emperors for centuries and hated some upstart Frank trying to play emperor out west for decades. Diplomacy was a tense game of insults disguised as titles and treaties signed under duress. But back home, that title stuck. Charlemagne ruled as emperor until his death in 814, and royal dignity shaped everything he did from laws to church reforms. That was his peak, a crown not just made of gold, but loaded with legitimacy, legend, and history, conquering half of Europe impressive, keeping it all from falling apart into civil war. Now that's real magic. And Charlemagne, strangely enough, pulled it off not just with blood and steel, but with ink, messengers, monks, and a medieval version of spreadsheets. Once emperor, he got serious about ruling, but when he got back home, that title stuck. Charlemagne ruled as emperor until he died in 814, and that royal dignity influenced everything he did, from making laws to reforming the church. That was the peak of his reign. A crown, not just made of gold, but soaked in legitimacy, legend, and history. Conquering half of Europe, impressive. Keeping it together without everything falling into civil war. That's the real magic trick. And Charlemagne, oddly enough, pulled it off not just with blood and steel, but with ink, messengers, monks, and a medieval version of spreadsheets. Once crowned emperor, Charlemagne got serious about ruling. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once, so he started building a system that looked like an early version of a modern bureaucracy, just with more Latin and slightly less bribery. The guys in charge of management, the Missi Dominici, literally God's messengers, probably. These were trusted officials, always sent in pairs, usually one noble and one bishop, to roam the empire and issue orders, hand down royal orders, check up on local lords, and make sure no one was quietly building their own mini-kingdom out in the boondocks. Think of them like medieval auditors, except with swords and divine backup. Local counts and dukes still ruled their areas, but they had to toe Charlemagne's line, and if they didn't, a friendly visit from the Missi Dominici could quickly turn into a chat that ended their career. Charlemagne was zero tolerance on disloyalty. He also issued decrees, written laws, and instructions across the whole empire. These covered everything from how to run a monastery to how many soldiers a noble had to provide, down to what kind of bread to serve at royal feasts. Yep, there were even bread rules, because you can't let an empire crumble over bad toast. But this wasn't just micromanaging for its own sake. Charlemagne believed in order the Christian kind, and to him, a stable, well-run empire showed God's favor. His laws weren't just legal, they were moral. He wanted a society where everyone knew their role, paid taxes to the church and to him, and prayed on schedule, preferably under a roof he had approved. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still happened. Communication was slow, and local lords sometimes quietly ignored orders when no one was looking. But for a guy ruling territory from the Pyrenees to Elba, it worked surprisingly well. By the early 800s, Charlemagne's empire was the largest in Europe since Rome fell. His lands stretched from today's France and Germany to northern Italy and parts of Central Europe, across multiple cultures, languages, and weather so bad it could freeze a bishop in July. This guy ruled Catholics, pagans, half-Christian tribes, ambitious nobles, and moody bishops. Somehow, he kept them all mostly in line. On the surface, everything looked great. The Carolingian Renaissance was in full swing. Monks copied books like caffeine-fueled hipsters. Law and order had a vague but unified shape. Even the coins bore Charlemagne's stern side profile, because nothing says, "I'm the boss," like slapping your face on every pocket. But beneath that grandeur, cracks were forming. First up, succession. Charlemagne had a ton of kids, at least 18 thanks to multiple wives and mistresses. But only a few were politically viable. He'd split the empire among 3 sons, like his dad did. Then one died. then another. By 806, he was down to one heir. Louis was devout, the youngest, and basically a monk in everything but name. Louis was a good Christian guy, quiet, thoughtful, kind. In other words, the total opposite of Charlemagne. When your empire runs on threats and iron will, handing it off to a guy who prefers hymns over politics is a risky move. Then there were the nobles under Charlemagne. They were kept in line by fear and strict control, but even then, local resistance kept growing. Some enforced royal law enthusiastically, others treated it like polite suggestions. The empire was stable, but it was basically a one-man cult, propped up by his presence and very few backup systems. Add endless wars, constant rebellions, especially from the still stubborn Saxons, and the cost of maintaining armies ramped up pressure. Even the church, mostly loyal, had its own ambitions. Bishops wielded political power. Abbots controlled massive lands. While they supported Charlemagne's rule with one hand, sometimes they pushed back with the other, especially when royal demands clashed with canon law or monastery budgets. This empire was grand, but like everything built with it, while they wholeheartedly backed Charlemagne's rule with one hand, they occasionally flipped him the bird with the other, especially when royal demands clashed with church laws or monastery budgets. The empire was huge, but like any giant project built at breakneck speed and size, it relied on one guy to call all the shots, and that guy was getting old. In the winter of 814, Charlemagne fell ill. He was in Aachen, his favorite palace city, surrounded by scholars, advisors, and the smell of burning wood mixed with parchment stained by ink. He was 72, a near miraculous age for a man who'd spent decades fighting, crossing mountains, and making sure every noble knew who was boss, despite his warrior image. His decline was slow and almost quiet. He fasted, prayed, and as Einhard, his devoted biographer, put it, faced death with the calm dignity befitting a Christian emperor on January 28th at 8:14 a.m. Charlemagne kicked the bucket. Bells tolled. The empire held its breath. They buried him in Aachen Cathedral beneath a marble throne, dressed in royal robes, sword at his side, and a copy of the Gospels on his lap. Not a bad send-off for a guy, once crowned Roman emperor in a surprise ceremony. Legend later claimed he sat upright in his tomb like some sleeping king, ready to rise if the empire needed him. Of course, total fantasy, but it's a nice story to tell his only surviving son, Louis, the devout heir who inherited the whole empire along with its unruly borders, rebellious nobles, and rising chaos. Louis tried to rule well. He really did, but he wasn't his dad. The iron grip loosened, power splintered, civil war kicked off. Within a few decades, the mighty empire Charlemagne built was sliced into pieces, eventually spawning France and Germany as separate kingdoms. Yet Charlemagne's legacy didn't vanish with his empire. It grew. He became a legendary figure, Carolus Magnus, the ideal Christian king. Popes remembered him fondly, emperors modeled themselves after. Him, the Holy Roman Empire, founded long after his death, claimed him as its spiritual daddy. Even Napoleon, or centuries later, mimicked Charlemagne's coronation, hoping to snag some of that ancient divine spotlight. Charlemagne didn't just unite Europe. He laid down a blueprint blending Roman law, German monarchy, and Christian faith. He helped pull a continent out of the Dark Ages wreckage and planted seeds for the nations that would shape it. When he died, the world lost a man but gained a legend, and legends, as Europe has shown time and again, are notoriously hard to bury. Medieval feasts weren't just about food. The point was to be seen. Picture this: long wooden tables draped in cloth, flickering torches casting shadows on stone walls, and the scent of roasted beer mingling with wine, sweat, and ambition. This wasn't dinner. It was theater. Every dish, every seat, every spoonful served was part of a carefully choreographed social ritual. In a world where birth decided your rank, feasts were the ruling class's way to remind everyone where they stood. Seating was a political chess move. The lord and lady sat at the high table, truly high status, both in furniture and rank. The closer you sat to them, the more important you were. If you found yourself staring at a drafty wall next to the musicians, you were not just cold, you were basically invisible. Food came out in courses, like acts in a play. The first might be stuffed peacocks with feathers glued back on just for show. Then came venison, swan, pigeons in pastry shells, and roasted ox heads with apples in their mouths. No subtlety here. If that animal once had a face, it was probably staring back at you, drenched in wine sauce. Then the fancy stuff, intricate edible sculptures made from sugar, almonds, or pastries shaped like castles, saints, mythical creatures, or biblical epic scenes. These weren't really meant to be eaten. They were made for people to admire or ogle, ideally both. But it's not just about flaunting wealth. The festival is a political tool. Treaties get hammered out between bites of pheasant. Alliances get sealed over spiced wine. Marriages arranged between courses. Throwing a lousy party could wreck your rep. Throwing an epic one could win you loyalty for years. Even silence has meaning. Guests aren't just allowed to chat freely. Congratulations are timed. Music nudges conversations along. Jugglers distract from awkward, quiet moments. Poets recite. Syrupy flattery so sweet it makes boredom bland. Behind every lavish medieval feast lies a chaotic masterpiece. The castle kitchen, not your cozy modern space with ceramic counters and herb gardens. Nope, this was a war zone full of smoke and fire, run by a hierarchy so strict even a small army would blush. At the top of this culinary command tower stood the master chef, think Gordon Ramsay of the day, minus the swearing, or with swearing in Latin. He managed dozens of assistants, spit turners, pot cooks, pastry makers, fish cleaners, ingredient suppliers, and at least one poor soul whose entire job was plucking poultry all day. And they weren't cooking 2 or 3 dishes. They made hundreds, often with no handwritten recipes, since cookbooks were rare. Handwritten and guarded more carefully than treasure chests. Fires blazed day and night. No thermostats, just blistered hands, guesswork, and prayers. Meat roasted on giant skewers turned by hand, usually by boys with tireless spinning hands. Depending on the size of the meat, imagine a cow becoming 100 pieces over a 3-day feast. Sauces were key. Everything got drenched in a mix of vinegar, wine, and weird spices, not because they wanted to hide rotten food, as rumored that would offend guests, but because spices were treasure saffron, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, all luxury imports. Serving them wasn't just about flavor. It was about boosting trade connections. This chicken tastes like cinnamon, basically the medieval version of pumpkin spice. Bread was the staple but came in many varieties. Nobles got fancy white bread. Servants got coarser brown loaves. And under each plate was a trench, an old piece of bread used like a plate to soak up all the grease, later eaten by lower classes or tossed to the dogs, or both, depending on how the dogs behaved. The aroma was a mix of herbs, meat, yeast, sweat, and fire. Noise was constant clanging, shouting, and occasionally the panicked honking of a goose still refusing to accept its fate. Not exactly charming, but effective, and without it, the whole illusion of natural nobility upstairs would collapse like a bad pie. If you ever got invited to a medieval feast, congratulations, you were either important, rich, or someone's political plaything. But what was actually on your plate? Let's just say if you're a picky eater, you might want to look away. Meat dominated the table: venison, wild boar, rabbit, deer, swan, even dolphin. If you were dining on a particularly weird coastline, anything that could walk, fly, swim, or vaguely look like meat was fair game. Literally, hunting was both a sport and the supply chain. Nobles went out and killed the food they'd later brag about eating. The rarer the animal, the higher the status. The main event was whole roasted beasts. Picture a pig snout polished, teeth bared, mouth stuffed with an apple, or a swan, feathers carefully smoothed back for the presentation. If it looked scary before, now it had to look majestic, but it wasn't just about quantity. The menu was strategic. You couldn't dump everything on the table at once. You served it in courses called eliminations. The first meal might include snacks, soup, small pies, fish if it was Friday and the church was watching. The first meal might include some snacks, soup, little meat pies, fish if it's Friday, and all under the watchful eyes of the church. Of course, later courses got fancier roast meats, game, meat pies, spices, and yes, even more meat. Fish made special appearances too, especially during fasting seasons. Eels, cod, and herring were the regular guests at the table, sometimes molded into animal shapes, but definitely not boring. Why serve plain boiled fish when you can plate it to look like a hedgehog and spices? Oh, spices. Medieval folks didn't just sprinkle them around for fun. Cinnamon on chicken, absolutely. Ginger and sauces, of course. Sugar on meat. Why not sweet and savory often? cozied up on the same plate, sometimes even the same bite. Meanwhile, veggies were suspiciously missing from fancy dishes, vegetables and greens, peasant food, too humble, too plain. Lords didn't like turnips unless stuffed inside unicorn-shaped pies. By the end of the feast, the menu had gone from mess to mind-blowing. The goal wasn't to fill hungry bellies. The goal was to dazzle, blind, leave your guests stuffed, stunned, and maybe a little scared for next time, because dessert might just breathe fire, while food was about clogging arteries and flaunting wealth. A medieval feast wasn't complete without entertainment, lots of it. You didn't just eat, you laughed, listened, gawked, and occasionally winced at whatever was happening between courses. Enter the fool, the palace jester decked out in bells, clashing colors, and bold enough to insult the host without losing his head. Usually, the fool's job was to make people laugh, mock the powerful, and stir up some controlled chaos. They juggled, so told stories, and pulled pranks with the skill of someone who knew a bad joke could mean unemployment or execution. Then there were the minstrels, hauling lute, harps, and trained voices ready to belt out ballads about love, war, and sometimes dragons. Music filled the hall, not just as background noise, but as part of the whole experience. These songs weren't just mood setters. They were political commentary, history lessons, and flattery disguised as catchy tunes. If the host got a heroic shout-out in verse 3, congrats. The minstrel was dining well that night. For extra excitement, you could catch acrobatics and fire breathing. Yep, real fire, inside a wooden hall lined with hay and rugs. Safety rules. What safety rules sword swallowers, animal tamers, even dancing bears showed up, though bears weren't always thrilled about it. Then came the subtle touches, edible performances, sugar sculptures doubling as political satire, giant pies stuffed with live birds, released mid-meal for dramatic effect. Nothing screams wealth like slicing a pie and watching doves fly out while polite guests clap and try not to soil themselves. Some festivals included morality plays, short theatrical skits about virtue, sin, or the dangers of disrespecting the church. These were performed by mercenaries or sometimes monks, way too enthusiastic about playing the devil. Everything was calculated. Entertainment kept spirits high, politics at bay, and no guest had time to quietly plot rebellion between sips of mead. A good entertainer could stop a duel before it started. One bad move could spark another at a medieval feast. You weren't just watching a show, you were the show, and laughter, just another way to avoid dodging knives aimed at the host. In medieval times, what you ate wasn't as important as who you ate with. The feast was the medieval version of a press conference, a proposal, court negotiations, and a hostile takeover all rolled into one thrilling event. Throwing a party wasn't just hospitality, it was strategy. It symbolized wealth, power, generosity, and control. Every detail from seating plans to sourcing sent a message. Take seating, for example. The high table wasn't just physically raised, it had social radiance. Lords and ladies sat in the middle, flanked by honored guests. It's all strategy. A meal wasn't just food, it screamed wealth, power, generosity, and control. Everything from seating arrangements to where the ingredients came from sent a message. Take seating, for example. The high table wasn't just physically elevated, it had social radiance. The lord and lady sat in the middle, flanked by the most important guests, bishops, foreign ambassadors, visiting nobles, if you were near the salt cellar. Congratulations, you were somebody. Everyone else was happy just to breathe the same sweaty air. That's where we get the phrase being above salt. You could sit close to the host and feel important, or be stuck near the floor with the minstrels and empty wine jugs. Invitations weren't handed out like candy. Getting called to a party meant you were someone. Saying no, yeah, that could get a gang of armed dudes to come ask why your seat's empty. Declining an invite was basically an open invitation for armed thugs to ask why your chair was empty. On the flip side, showing up might mean you're switching sides. Every guest list was a political minefield. Even the food sent a message. Serving a local specialty could please a visiting duke. Each guest list was a political minefield. The food itself carried a message. Serving some local specialty could impress a visiting duke. Bringing an overkill amount of game meant, check out how vast and rich my lands are, even with exotic spices, basically bragging. I've got trade deals you can only dream of. Even wine was loaded with meaning. Was it local, imported, blessed by a bishop? And don't forget the gifts. Guests sometimes brought jewelry, relics, horses, and were expected to flatter the host. Guests sometimes brought offerings, jewelry, relics, horses, and were expected to shower the host with compliments. Raising a glass was part flattery, part showing off, and sometimes a subtle warning. Parties were also alliance-building arenas. A marriage could be sealed with a honey-glazed quail. A land dispute might be settled by moving for the third time. And if all else failed, a rival lord might get drunk enough to sign something stupid or be poisoned and unable to wake up the next morning. With all its greed and glam, medieval partying was heavily influenced by an authority that even kings couldn't touch the church, and the church had opinions, strong ones, about what you could eat, when, and how guilty you should feel afterward. The church had strong opinions about what you could eat, when, and just how guilty you should feel afterward. In medieval history, fasting days outnumbered feast days. No exaggeration. Nearly half the year was marked by some kind of diet restriction. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, various vigils, you name it. Not exaggerating. Nearly half the year was locked down with some form of dietary restrictions. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, various vigils, you name it. And on those days, land animal meat was totally banned from the table, literally. So how did the nobility cope with creativity? Of course, they still threw parties. They just swapped ingredients. On those days, land animal meat was completely off the table, literally. So how'd the nobles manage? With creativity, they still partied, just switched up the ingredients. Beef, pork, and venison were out. In came fish, eggs, almonds, and anything that could pretend it wasn't technically meat. Beef, pork, and venison were out. Instead, fish, eggs, almonds, and anything that could pretend it wasn't technically meat took center stage. For example, beaver meat was considered fish because beavers have scales and live underwater. Problem solved. God approved. Loopholes. Right dishes turned into culinary gymnastics. Chefs sculpted almond milk into fake cheese. Fish got dressed up as roast. Some meals looked sinful but technically played by the rules. Some meals looked sinful but technically followed the rules. And, of course, wine didn't count as food. It was never counted on saint days or sacred occasions. Wine didn't count as food. It was never tallied on saint days or sacred events. Still, it was festival season, and the church had its own parties too. Easter, Christmas, Epiphany. These weren't just holy days, they were excuses to eat everything in sight. Easter, Christmas, Epiphany. These weren't just holy days, they were basically excuses to eat everything in sight. A Christmas feast could last 12 days, each dish bigger and more absurd than the last, because nothing says Christ's birth like a pie stuffed with 4 kinds of birds. Monasteries weren't exempt, though monks were supposed to live humbly. Some monasteries got famous for their kitchens. A rich monastery might fast on oysters and spiced eels. Monks built precise eating schedules, seasonal menus, and clever substitutes to keep bellies full and their guilt technically in check. Food was spiritual business. Parties weren't just indulgence, they were sacred performances. You gave thanks before eating, offered gifts to the church afterward, and prayed your cook didn't serve meat on the wrong Thursday. In medieval times, gluttony was a sin, but partying with holiness, that was practically a sacrament. For all the meat roasters and silly jugglers out there, a medieval feast was no free-for-all. Tons of rules. In fact, if you wanted to keep your status and your seat, you had to know how to act like a proper noble with grease-covered hands. First rule, don't touch your food like a peasant. Forks weren't widespread yet, so most folks ate with their hands, but there was a system. You used the first 3 fingers of your, and that's where the story continues. Right hand only. Absolutely no left fingers. Unless you want people whispering about witchcraft or terrible hygiene. And number 2, don't lick your fingers until the meal's over. Washing hands in the communal basin between courses, totally fine. But finger licking at dinner, that's low class, like showing up shoeless or being the French in an English castle. Everyone's got their own knife. And yes, they bring their own knives. The host doesn't supply cutlery, just the food and a spot to rest your blade. Your knife's not just for cutting. It's like your medieval iPhone gotta make a statement. Flashy handle check. You're important. Rusty blade. Also check. Enjoy sitting by the fire. Drinking etiquette. That's its own battlefield. You don't just gulp wine. You toast. You sip. You offer a glass to your neighbor, especially if you're trying to bribe them or politely dare them to neck a gem right after. And yep, you share cups. Germ theory not invented yet. Plus, everyone's too busy dying from plague to care about lip contact. Then there's chatting. You're supposed to talk, but not too much. Laugh, but keep it down. Compliment the food, but not the host. Don't talk with your mouth full unless you're insulting someone's looks. And don't burp unless you're Mongolian. drunk, or both. At fancier parties, hand washing is practically a ritual. Servants pour scented water over guests' hands, usually before washing and again before dessert, not to prove how refined everyone is, but to show you belong here. Slip up one spill wine, get a dirty sleeve, reach too far across the table, and poof, you're booted from the Lord's party. Back to the dogs you go. And guess what? Dogs don't share wine. After the last swan, after the cake's cut, after the final toast, and the idiots kicked out for juggling bread rolls in the bishop's cup, one question remains. What happened to all the food, medieval feasts, gobbled enormous amounts buttered bread, pies, salted fish, sugar cakes, and those juice-soaked trenchers? Even the hungriest nobles couldn't eat it all. Waste was a luxury. What you didn't eat sent a message as loud as what you served. So, where did it all go if you were lucky? To the servants. They'd eat in shifts after the party, scavenging leftovers from under the tables. Sometimes they got the best cuts, especially if a favored guest handed over their whole roast or passed on the hedgehog-stuffed pie. Not glamorous, but way better than gruel. Trencher's thick slices of bread used as plates were special cases, soaked in sauce and grease. Nobles rarely touched them unless they were seriously wasted. Instead, these soggy bread plates were gathered and usually handed out to the poor. Not out of charity, mind you, more like the nobles saying, "Here, have the leftovers of our greatness." But if you were a peasant, getting a greasy, spiced beef slice beat a sermon on humility any day. In monasteries and churches, leftover food became a weapon. Feeding the poor wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Leftovers were tossed into baskets, blessed maybe after some fingers were pulled off, and handed out as a moral duty. Sometimes the poor even got invited to eat in the great hall after the nobles left. Though their seats were far less comfy and definitely lacked the juggling bear, but not all leftovers made it to hungry mouths. Some food was simply thrown away, fed to pigs, or piled up in the castle, because in medieval high society, restraint was way overrated. Excess signaled wealth. Letting food rot quietly behind the kitchen door was part of the show. So while the sober nobles toasted their well-planned feast, life went on for everyone else. The servants gnawed bones. Sometimes they'd carve out the choicest bits, especially if a favored guest generously handed over their whole roast, or decided not to eat the hedgehog-shaped meat pie. Not glamorous, but way better than gruel. Trencher bread, thick slices used as plates, was a special case, soaked in sauce and fat. Nobles rarely touched it, unless they were seriously wasted. Instead, these soggy bread plates were gathered up and usually handed out to the poor. Not charity, mind you, more like nobles saying, "Here, have some leftovers from our greatness." But for a peasant, soaking up some fatty spiced beef was better than any sermon on humility. In monasteries and churches, leftover food from feasts became a weapon. Feeding the poor wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Leftovers were gathered into baskets, blessed, maybe after some fingers got pricked, and distributed like a moral duty. Sometimes the poor were even invited to dine. In the great hall after the nobles left, though seated way differently, and usually without a juggling bear. Still, not all leftovers made it to hungry mouths. Some food was simply tossed out, fed to pigs, or left to rot in castle heaps. Why, because in high medieval society, restraint was king. Excess showed wealth. Letting food quietly spoil behind kitchen doors was just part of the show. So while nobles toasted themselves for throwing a proper feast, life went on for everyone else. Servants gnawed bones, peasants lined up to dig ditches, dogs fought over fish heads, because in the medieval world, even leftovers had a hierarchy. Candles burned low, minstrels snored under benches, half the guests face-planted into meat pies. The other half staggered through castle halls, hunting for shoes or whatever dignity they had left. The party was over, but come morning, a whole different ritual began. Cleanup started even before the guests. The servants moved like ghosts, clearing bones, scraping oysters, and sweeping away reed grass from the floor. Aromatic herbs were strewn about to mask the smell of sweat, spilled wine, and some seriously bad breath. The reed grass had to be changed often, especially after a party where the floor soaked up way more than just breadcrumbs. Then came the reckoning. The steward, basically the medieval party planner, assessed the damage: broken cups, missing silverware, suspicious amounts of sauce spilled near the bishop's chair. All of it went into the report. Sometimes guests even stole cutlery as a weird badge of honor. If you walked away with a spoon, congrats, you were important enough to risk it. The kitchen was a war zone. Burnt pots, cracked plates, and grease piled high on the carts. The chefs shuffled out like survivors, some missing eyebrows from the oven fire, others grumbling, "Next time, let's just make porridge." But for the host, the real work was just starting. The politics of gratitude kicked in. Letters were written, gifts sent, compliments returned. If a powerful guest wasn't properly thanked, or worse, sat too far from the roast swan, resentment brewed. And medieval grudges, they often turned into hatred or war. Sometimes a party backfired, a guest insulted, an ally offended, a drunken noble confessing treason over stale wine. The wrong thank you note could wreck months of diplomacy. The feast was a performance, sure, but like any stage, criticism could kill you. For everyone else, the morning after was business as usual. Some washed dishes, some scooped up leftovers. A lucky few found an abandoned almond cake behind the altar, breakfast of champions. Then the castle quietly slipped back into its usual rhythm. Flags lowered, dogs fed, torches snuffed until the next celebration, be it a coronation, wedding, or just a chance to show off to the neighbors. The festival season was over, but its echoes hung in the air like smoke on the beams and wine stains on the stone. Because in the medieval world, no one forgot a lavish feast or a terrible one. Leif Erikson didn't just stumble into this world quietly. Around 970, maybe Iceland, maybe Greenland, depends on which version you want to believe. He was born into a family of exiles, full of ambition and spectacularly bad impulse control. His dad was Eric the Red, a hot-tempered, outlawed Norwegian banished for murder, then booted out of Iceland for something even worse. Instead of learning to chill, Eric discovered Greenland, Because if you're about to get banned from one icy island, why not just conquer another? Leif grew up in this rough frontier settlement, where winters were brutal, neighbors rare, and the only thing passed around were stories. Greenland wasn't a prosperous colony. It was a stubborn outpost kept alive by driftwood, fish, and pure stubbornness. But it gave Leif something more valuable than comfort perspective. He understood what it meant to survive at the edge of the known world. His family soaked up. Norse tradition: drink mead, fight hard, and always distrust outside authority. Yet even in this tough culture, Leif stood out, curious, thoughtful, observant. According to legend, he was tall, strong, handsome, natural, and remarkably more considerate than his moody dad. He wasn't raised on books or scholars. He was raised on legends, oral tales of gods, monsters, voyages, and revenge. These weren't bedtime stories. They were survival guides wrapped in mythology, sinking into Leif like sea mercury into a longship's hull. Greenland's isolation made young Leif crave something more, unlike, seeped into the longship like mercury into the hull. Greenland's isolation made young Leif crave something more, unlike his father, whose ambitions ended in exile and bloodshed. Leif looked outward to Iceland, to Norway, to the horizon. He listened to old sailors talk about strange lands beyond the ice. He studied the stars, watched the tides. By adulthood, he wasn't just Eric the Red Sun. He was a Viking with a ship, a brain, and a burning desire to discover something. Anything but a cold rock filled with equally cold egos. Before he sailed west, before churches claimed his name, before he starred in epics and textbooks, Leif Erikson was a boy born of fire and ice, destined to outdo both. Leif didn't just drift into greatness, he sailed there. At some point in his early adulthood, Leif left Greenland and headed to Norway, the old Norse power hub. It wasn't just a homecoming. It was a smackdown with a much fancier, more hierarchical, and surprisingly pious world. Norway was no longer the place his dad escaped from. Now it was ruled by King Olaf, Tryggvason, a crown-wearing, sword-wielding dude obsessed with converting Norse folks to Christianity. Whether they liked it or not, life threw Olaf at him, a warrior king swapping ancient grudges for baptisms and longships for churches. And unlike many of his fellow Norsemen, Leif didn't mock him. Nope. He listened. Maybe diplomacy, maybe curiosity, or maybe Leif was just over the endless cycle of raids, revenge, and gods who mostly demanded blood and beer, whatever it was. Leif got baptized, embraced Christianity, and got handed a shiny new job: bring the faith back to Greenland. Not exactly a walk in the park. Picture trying to explain monotheism to farmers who regularly sacrificed goats to Thor whenever the weather acted up. Greenland was a remote, suspicious place, still pretty loyal to Odin, Freya, and the whole Thunder Gang. But Leif didn't show up empty-handed. He brought priests, knowledge, and royal backing. When he set foot in Greenland again, he wasn't just a chieftain's son. He was the messenger of a king and a new god. And while he didn't spark an overnight revival, his influence started to take root. Christianity began creeping into the icy circles, Chapels went up, crosses were raised. The old gods weren't kicked out immediately, but they suddenly had serious competition. This was a turning point. Leif wasn't just a sailor or settler anymore. He was a cultural bridge, a guy stuck between two worlds, Norse tradition and Christian order, pagan legends and written laws, one foot in Valhalla, the other in Bethlehem, and while juggling converting neighbors and keeping fragile peace. Leif Erikson started hearing tales about strange lands to the west, lands with grapes, forests, and no snow in sight. The next great voyage was calling. Some epic discoveries start with ambition. Others begin with just plain bad navigation. Leif Erikson set sail from Norway with high hopes, bring Christianity to Greenland, and maybe check out family drama on the way. But fate, or the notoriously cranky North Atlantic weather, had other plans. According to Greenlandic legend, Leif caught whispers about a strange western land, spotted years earlier by a guy named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd glimpsed unknown shores but never bothered to stop. Mainland, classic Bjarni discover North America, then sail off like he'd left groceries in the car. But Leif was made of different wood. Around the year 1000ers, he bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew, and decided to explore what lay beyond the horizon. He wasn't just heading into unknown territory, he was sailing into legend, a journey full of danger icebergs, storms, and the genuine risk of falling off the edge of the world. But Leif stayed calm, steady, and true to the stories, annoyingly skilled. Eventually, his ship reached a place, classic Bjarni, the guy who discovered North America and then just sailed off like he had a grocery store on board. But Leif was cut from different wood. Around the year 1000 hours, he bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew, and decided to explore what lay beyond the horizon. He wasn't just sailing into the unknown, he was sailing into legend, a journey full of danger, icebergs, storms, and the real possibility of falling off the edge of the world made it all the more thrilling. But Leif stayed cool, steady, and true to the stories, was annoyingly talented. Eventually, his ship reached a place totally unlike Greenland. First up was a barren land he called Helluland, probably today's Baffin Island Flat, rocky, and honestly, pretty meh. Then came Markland, maybe Labrador, with thick forests enough to build a whole fleet. Useful, sure, but still not exactly paradise. Finally, Leif landed somewhere mild and rich enough that his crew named it Vinland, the land of wine, or grapes, or maybe just fermented berries. The stories are fuzzy, and the Norse weren't exactly known for luxury. Still, this place was paradise compared to the icy death trap they called home. They built houses, explored rivers, and enjoyed the novelty of not having to chip ice just to get a drink. Leif called the main settlement Budahufen, basically, the harbor of life. Budahufen, a humble name for a man who accidentally made history. He stayed through winter, mapped the land, gathered wood, and cooked up stories that would shake the North when he got back. No grand conquests, no wars, just quiet, practical exploration, pretty modern for a Viking. Honestly, Leif didn't plant flags or claim ownership. He just observed, named stuff, and left. Yet somehow, that made him the first European to set foot in North America, before Columbus, before maps, before anyone even knew what he'd done. Leif Erikson's landing at Vinland should have kicked off a Norse golden age. Mild climate, wild grapes, tall trees, no frostbite. What more could a Greenlander want? But paradise came with problems, especially when you don't ask the locals. The natives might not have been thrilled about visitors. Legend says Leif and his crew spent a winter in Vinland, camping and gathering precious resources. They found wild wheat, vast forests, and enough fish to feed a whole battalion of warriors. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a solution. Cold, barren, and isolated Greenland versus mild, promising Vinland. But Leif didn't colonize it. No royal claims, no churches, no second settlement ship. He just sailed home to Greenland with a hold full of wood and a story nobody believed. Why the legends don't say much. But what happened next shows Leif knew Vinland was far from empty. Later Norse expeditions, led by his brother Thorvald, sister Freydis, and others, ran into brutal clashes with the locals, whom they called Skraelings. Not exactly empty. Later Norse expeditions, led by his brother Thorvald, sister Freydis, and others, saw intense clashes with the locals they called Skraelings. Who these folks were is still up for debate. Could be ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, or Inuit. But one thing's clear, they were not thrilled about heavily armed strangers showing up with axes and attitude. Even though Leif's trip didn't spill blood, he probably realized this land wasn't theirs. No conquest attempts, no torching villages, no bodies or churches left behind. Instead, he quietly packed up and left. The promise of Vinland haunted Norse memories for generations nearby, fertile land that was just too off-limits. Later voyages tried to settle there, but tensions with locals, the vast distance from backup, and the dangers of overextending doomed the idea before it could take root. Leif's discovery was just too early. The Norse world wasn't ready. The ocean too huge, politics too fragile, and settlers too few. Vinland slipped into legend half paradise, half ghost story, and Leif. He returned to Greenland not as a conqueror, but as a man who'd glimpsed something no one else had. A world waiting out there, but not for them. When Leif Erikson came back from Vinland, he didn't bring gold or glory. Nope. He brought something way more controversial: Christianity. Back in Norway, Leif got baptized by order of King Olaf Tryggvason, who saw sword and cross as equally handy tools for building a nation. Leif quietly embraced this new faith, no fanfare, no drama, but now, with a royal mission and a ship full of priests, he returned to Greenland as a father, explorer, and its first missionary. Still, Greenland barely changed while he was gone. The colony stuck to its old Norse pagan ways. People carved runes, drank to Odin, and muttered prayers to Thor during blizzards. They were settlers, survivors, practical and fiercely traditional, and super suspicious of a religion that said all their gods were wrong, and that drinking blood on the solstice might be a no-go. Leif didn't storm temples or torch statues. That wasn't his style. Instead, he played diplomat, generous host, and royal-backed envoy. Skiz built what's thought to be Greenland's first church, gave priests a roof over their heads, chatted up chieftains, and spun stories, not only about Christ, but about a kinder world beyond the ice and exile. His mom, Theodildes, converted and built her own chapel. His dad, Eric the Red, famously refused. Eric wasn't having any of. This new god who didn't like blood sacrifices and didn't even fight with a hammer. To Eric, Christianity was weakness. To Leif, it was the way forward. This family feud echoed the bigger split in Greenland. Some saw this faith as progress, protection, or just a way to butter up the king. Others thought it was just noisy outside interference. Converts and traditionalists shared equal parts worry and suspicion. Leif didn't force change. He simply embodied it, living as both a Norseman and a Christian, a sailor and a settler. His quiet strength made him a symbol not just of faith, but of balance, evolution without erasure. He didn't kill the old gods. He just stopped calling them, and for a colony at the edge of the world, his example was enough to plant the seed of something new, even if it took generations to sprout. Leif Erikson might have made his own legend in the North Atlantic, but he did it under a long, bloody shadow. His father, Eric the Red, wasn't just notorious, he was a true legend, a brawler, a settler, a man exiled from Norway and Iceland who went on to found Greenland just to get kicked out of there too, wherever Eric went. He sent shivers down spines, and neighbors always kept their axes handy. His temper was legendary, his charm even more so. For Leif, growing up in Eric's house meant learning to balance boldness with recklessness, leadership with a dash of crazy. If Eric was fire, Leif was ice. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, yet people still followed him. The folks in Greenland respected this guy's chill vibe. He didn't conquer with a sword, but with some serious leadership skills. And honestly, that's probably exactly what the colony needed. But that comparison never really fades. Leif came back from Vinland not with gold, but with wood and furs. His missionary work in Greenland spread, so slowly. Meanwhile, Eric was sulking and mocking. The old man wanted a warrior son to carry on his brutal legacy. Instead, he got an explorer, a man of faith, a diplomat who preferred talk over steel. Some called that a weakness. Others called it wisdom. Leif didn't care. He wasn't trying to outdo Eric. He was just trying to survive him. When Eric the Red died, some said it was illness. Others said slow mental collapse. It marked the end of a certain kind of Norseman. Eric stood for the old gods, exile, and explosive pride. Leif stood for something else, a future beyond icy fjords and bloody battles. Their relationship in the stories seems tense. Eric hated Leif's new faith. Leif tried to convince him. No one budged, but there was respect, maybe even secret admiration. Eric knew his son wasn't cut from the same savage cloth, and maybe deep down, he was okay with that. Leif never became king. He never ruled by brute force, but he outlived his father in spirit and history. He led Greenland into a new chapter, maybe less dramatic, but way more sustainable. And sometimes, greatness isn't about slaying your dad's demons. Sometimes it's about refusing to inherit them. After Vinland, after building churches, after Eric the Red was gone, Leif Erikson stopped chasing glory. No second expeditions, no new conquests. Instead, he did something totally un-Viking. He stayed home for the rest of his life. Leif lived in Brattahlid, Greenland, the settlement his dad built. But while Eric ruled with raw power, Leif ruled with calm. He became a leader, sure, but more than that. A symbol not of violence, but of continuity, quiet leadership in a changing world. We don't know much about his later years. Stories get fuzzy. His name fades from the big action scenes. But he's still there, respected, remembered, just not center stage anymore. He raised a family. His son, Thorleif, would one day lead Greenland. Christianity spread slow but steady. The colony survived, but Vinland, the place that was supposed to change everything, didn't. Others tried to follow him. His brother Thorvald sailed west and got killed by native resistance. His sister Freydis led a betrayal-filled, axe-wielding, bad decision-making expedition. Every attempt to settle Vinland failed not because of lack of land, but because the Norse world just wasn't ready. Distance, hostility, limited support. Leif knew the risks. That's why he never went back. He proved it could be done. He saw what lay beyond the sea. But he also knew Greenland needed stability more than heroics. Over time, Vinland became legend, half memory, half dream. Some believe it, some don't. But Leif never shouted his discovery from mountaintops. He never demanded credit or sang his own praises. He didn't need to. He understood something rare. Sometimes making history means knowing when to step back. His final days were probably spent gazing at the sea, remembering a trip no one thought was possible, and as far as we know, he died quietly and peacefully in Greenland, not on a battlefield, not on a ship, just at home. Leif Erikson, the explorer who went farther than any Norseman before him, ended his life not chasing horizons, but anchoring others to them, was killed off by native resistance. His sister Freydis led a mission full of betrayal, axe killings, and terrible decisions. Every attempt to settle Vinland failed not for lack of land, but because the Norse world wasn't ready. Distance, hostility, limited support. Leif knew the risks. That's why he never returned. He had proved the trip was doable. He saw what was beyond the sea. But he also knew Greenland needed stability more than heroics. Over time, Vinland became legend, half memory, half dream. Some believe it, others don't. But Leif never shouted his discovery from a mountaintop. He never demanded fame or sang for applause. He didn't need to because he understood something rare. Sometimes, making history means knowing when to step back. His final days were probably spent staring at the sea, remembering the trip nobody thought possible. And, as far as we know, he died quietly and peacefully in Greenland, not on a battlefield, not on a ship, just at home. Leif Erikson, the explorer who went farther than any Norseman before him, ended his life not chasing horizons, but anchoring others to them. Leif Erikson might have lived quietly, but his story didn't die with him. It mutated, moved, and multiplied not through historians, but in storytellers. And as we know, storytellers have a loose relationship with facts. The main sources on Leif's life, the Greenland Saga and the Saga of Eric the Red, were written 2 centuries later, after he passed away. It's like trying to write Napoleon's biography based on your grandpa's fishing tales. They're impressive, sure, but also wildly exaggerated, rich in detail, and suspiciously convenient. One story paints Leif as a Viking missionary spreading Christianity with the calm of a Nordic saint. Another casts him as a bold explorer who stumbled into North America. Others toss in side quests, omens, prophetic dreams, basically anything to spice up the story. Then there's Freydis, his sister, sometimes portrayed as a fierce warrior who scared off attackers while heavily pregnant, yelling and slapping a sword against her bare chest. True, probably not. But would you want to mess with her? Definitely not. The fascinating part is how fact and legend get braided into a knot you can't untangle. Leif didn't brag, but his story got juicier with every retelling. Over time, he became a symbol of adventure, faith, endurance, a Norse guy daring to sail west before anyone thought it mattered. Then he vanished, buried under centuries of dust, overshadowed by louder, bloodier names. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that Leif re-emerged, resurrected by historians eager to find a European who beat Columbus to America. Suddenly, statues popped up. Streets got named after him. Erickson Day was declared a National Life Day in the U.S. October 9th, based purely on immigration papers. Ironically, Leif hated all that attention. He wasn't chasing fame. He didn't plant flags. He just did what Vikings normally did, sail into unknown lands and grab what they could. But history had other plans. Now, the quiet Greenlanders without books, speeches, or bragging rights is remembered as the guy who discovered a continent even though he never claimed it. Leif Erikson never built an empire. He didn't fight major battles. He didn't rule a kingdom or wear a golden crown. But he survived not by demanding a spot in history, but by quietly earning it. While others chased fame with fire and blood, Leif sailed west into the unknown, led by curiosity, not conquest. He never called himself a hero or saint. No monuments, didn't even try to hold on to the land he found. He just went, saw, and came back. A rare kind of explorer who didn't need the world to remember. His name to prove his trip mattered, and that's still true. Leif's legacy lives in stories, in oral sagas passed down centuries, retold by poets, chroniclers, poets again, and politicians. The Greenland boy became a symbol of exploration, resilience, and quiet strength. His journey to Vinland became a chapter in a bigger Norse epic, a civilization daring to sail past the edge of the known world, seeking not war, but possibility in modern times. Life got a second life. Statues rose in Boston, Seattle, Trondheim, and Reykjavik. He's shown as a proud Norseman gazing west, shading his eyes like he's still scanning the hazy tree line for a shadowy shore. Schools named after him, ships too, and every October 9th. A handful of Americans even remember he beat Columbus by nearly 500 years. But maybe his greatest legacy isn't about discovery or distance. It's about balance. He stood between two worlds, pagan and Christian, chaos and order, old gods and new faith. He didn't force change. He embodied it. He led without shouting. He converted without a fight. He proved courage isn't always loud, and history sometimes shouted out. He converted without any drama. He proved that bravery doesn't always have to be loud, and history sometimes favors the folks who just do the right thing and quietly head home. Ericsson's life never asked to be a headline, but in a world that often confuses noise with greatness, his story reminds us that legends aren't always forged in fire.